agency and how can you say that you're responsible for something, and the way choice works in that kind of agency and original sin. Unfortunately, I know all these parts. I don't know how they fit together yet, and I'm really I don't know if today I'm going to learn that or not.
Yeah. So today I'm going to offer like a 10-page précis of the book manuscript that's sitting on some editor's desk somewhere, and only God knows what's happening to it right now. But yeah, so I've been working on these questions for a long time, I guess, like 8 years maybe, and I hope they've coalesced in this book manuscript, which I hope will get published in a year or so. And the working title, which is kind of awkward, I think, is Determination, Disease, and Original Sin, an Augustinian essay on responsibility. So I'm going to try to give you a taste of a number of those points in that manuscript today. I hope it's not going to be too quick, because there's a fair amount of ground to cover to both give you the big picture and to keep it interesting. So I don't want to get lost in the details, but feel free to ask me to fill in the details. So I'm going to, I think, talk for about half an hour, and then there'll be hopefully half an hour for Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions while I'm talking, write them down.
And I'll be the bad guy who vows to end us promptly at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So if someone's making a profound point at 2 o'clock and I call time, don't take it personally.
I have a class at 2:30, so I'll have to leave, but I'm happy to stay around a little bit after 2 o'clock and chat with people, since my class prep is, So in recent months, maybe you've read the news, maybe you read the news as often as I do, I don't know. We've heard that racism is America's original sin. And comments like that make a person like me ask, what is original sin anyway? So that's what we're going to talk about to start off with. The idea of original sin, I believe, is an ancient answer to the puzzle of whether an individual's moral evil can have an external source. Can things outside you make you morally bad? Obviously, things outside of you can make you bruised and bad in that sense, right? But can they change your moral status? The doctrine of original sin contends that we are shaped in tragic ways that it is appropriate to call not just evil, but sin. Now, this might seem like a depressing view of the human condition, but I contend that it is ultimately both more fair and more hopeful than more supposedly optimistic alternatives. Because the knowledge of some of our most serious failings, the knowledge that some of our most serious failings is not simply up to us, provides crucial insight into the nature and conditions of human action. It permits us to treat one another with the respect due to those who are not simply puppets, but morally responsible. And it motivates us to respond even to evildoers graciously, precisely because we are aware of one of the deepest problems of evil. The idea of original sin has many implications, including the idea that all human beings do evil things, and that it is difficult to be good. But although these are implications of any doctrine of original sin, appropriately so called, they do not constitute the core of the idea of original sin. And they're often confused with that idea of original sin. So I think it's important to make that distinction. The core of original sin is often thought to be the idea of an historic fall. People back sometime named Adam and Eve sinned. As you probably know, St. Augustine, the historic fountainhead of the doctrine of original sin, although I think not the inventor of the doctrine, believed that there was a mysterious event in human history ages ago when the very first human beings had the first ever evil thought or desire. This idea, which I call the primal sin, is not equivalent to the idea of original sin, however. Christians and Jews would not have been interested in the idea of an historic fall if not for the fact that this idea has significant ethical content that does important work in theology. The idea that there was a time before sin when human beings were morally innocent and then a first sin provides an empirical basis for the claim that sin is not a necessary feature of finite creatures like ourselves. It makes a distinction between finitude and sinfulness, because it says you can be finite and not sin. So it's a way of emphasizing the idea that sin is a contingent aspect of a fundamentally good, finite human existence. But our topic today is not this question of whether evil is a necessary feature of finitude, or the related question of whether there was an historic fall. Our topic is original sin. To talk about original sin properly is to talk about the idea that sin can be inherited. Or to put the point slightly more expansively, the conceptual center of the doctrine of original sin is the difficult question of whether a person's moral evil can originate outside that person. Let me try to explain what I mean. First, what is sin? Well, clearly it's historically a religious term, and it generally refers to a misrelation between a creature and that creature's creator, between us and God, as well as screwed up relationships to yourself and between yourself and the world around you. Okay, but what kind of misrelationships do we have in mind? There are all kinds of ways to be wrongly related to things. Not all of them are sin. Stubbing your toe on a rock is one way of being misrelated to creation, but that doesn't seem like it's sin. So as far as I can tell, the best way to account for traditional uses of the word sin is to say that a sin is something bad or something wrong, and that a person is blameworthy for. So succinctly put, sin is culpable evil. Now, it's quite possible to do something evil but not be responsible for it. Let's say that you hate your own mother for no good reason, but that it turns out you were insane while you hit your mother. Well, in that case, you did something evil, hit your mother, but you're not really culpable because you weren't responsible because you were insane. So, sin is a helpfully precise word. It picks out not mere evil, but culpable evil. Evils for which we are not simply responsible, but in fact blameworthy. The idea of inherited sin is more complex. St. Augustine had two theories about inherited sin, and I only think one of them is very defensible. The second one. Briefly, the first one is that the entire human race can be summed up in a representative, namely Adam. There's a kind of collective identity in which whatever Adam does, we also do, Augustine thought. So, Augustine thought, bless you, when Adam sins, we all sin with Adam. He speaks about a lump of humanity which shares Adam's features, including Adam's primal sin. That's one way of talking about inherited sin. It's a way of talking about collective guilt. The second way, which is the one I'm going to focus on below because I find it more plausible, is the idea that we are socially constructed in certain respects. And because of that, we can inherit identity characteristics. Parts of our identity can be inherited. These include, Augustine thinks, disoriented hearts and minds, immoral beliefs and inappropriate desires, which together motivate evil actions, for instance, like slavery, which Augustine considered evil, along with many other kinds of sin. How this sort of sin is passed from one generation to the next is a topic that Augustine found confusing. He thought it was passed on in whatever way human personality gets passed on, and he thought that had something to do with sex, but he wasn't quite sure about the details. What he was convinced of is that human beings exist in solidarity with each other, such that we are dependent upon one another, even to the radical extent that we can influence one another's moral personalities. And that, briefly, is the version of Augustine's doctrine of original sin I want to focus on. So the key idea is his notion that we are radically morally vulnerable to each other, sometimes for better, but also for worse. Now, this doctrine of original sin is often rejected as unfair, and that's the charge I want to address today. I'm not going to argue that the doctrine of original sin is true. I'm going to argue that it's not immoral to believe in the doctrine of original sin, and that it would not be unfair for there to be such a thing as original sin. First, let me try to clarify what might be thought unfair about original sin. Augustine's doctrine, as I've just said, is the idea that we are constituted as morally evil by powers outside ourselves, and that we are culpable, blameworthy, for that evil as soon as we are culpable for anything. Now I'll just make a note here. Augustine thinks that we are culpable for things as soon as we're born. I'm not sure that's true. So this is an important point of disagreement that maybe we'll come back to in the Q&A. The general point is that we are culpable for this inherited evil as soon as we are culpable for anything. Now this idea should not be confused with other doctrines that Augustine subscribed to. For instance, the idea that hell exists, or the idea that there are some people in hell, or the idea that while God could save people from hell, he doesn't elect to save everybody from hell for whatever reasons. These doctrines are very widely disliked these days, and my only point about them in this talk is that they are not relevant to it. It is perfectly possible, it's logically coherent, to believe both a doctrine of original sin and the doctrine that everybody ends up eternally happy in heaven. So it's important not to conflate Augustine's other commitments with his doctrine of original sin. People sometimes reject the doctrine of original sin because they think it means eternal damnation, but since it doesn't, that's a bad reason to reject the doctrine of original sin. So if we want to understand what might be unfair about the doctrine of original sin, we can't talk about hell. We have to talk about something else. That something else is, I think, the idea that we can be responsible and, in fact, blamed for an inherited condition. And this in itself is a pretty scandalous idea. No reference to hell is necessary to make people shake their heads disapprovingly. In fact, most modern theologians have rejected the idea of original sin, philosophers too, because it just seems like it's kind of like a disease, but that you get blamed for. And that just doesn't seem appropriate. We don't fault people simply for having genetic defects, the logic goes, so neither should we fault a person for having been constituted as evil in some other way. That just seems like a case of blaming the victim. Here then is the basic charge against the notion of original sin that must be dealt with. The idea that original sin unfairly makes victims morally responsible. How can you be responsible for something you are passive towards? So, it would be helpful to say something briefly about this term, responsibility. What do we mean? When I speak about responsibility, I mean to invoke the idea of accountability, or something that you're answerable for. This is basically a backward-looking, rather than a forward-looking understanding. When we speak of responsibility in a forward-looking manner, we tend to be thinking about our responsibilities, our duties, the things that we ought to do, the things that we should do. Moral responsibility, though, tends to be a look back at what we did or didn't do, and whether we're accountable for it, and how. The metaphor of a ledger can help us understand this notion. We can think of responsibility as having a book in which the things that are written up in that book are the things that you are responsible for. Kind of like a ledger. It's in this sense of the term responsibility that it seems unfair to call persons responsible for original sin. Okay, but why exactly is it unfair to be considered responsible for an inherited constitutional fault? Well, it turns out there are a great many answers to this question, and some of them are in conflict with each other. But let me just mention two of the most common ones. First, it seems like you don't have any voluntary choice about whether you're going to have an inherited constitutional fault. People don't get to choose whether they have original sin. They can't avoid it. Well, okay, but then how can I be responsible for something that I couldn't have avoided? If I'd had an alternative to being sinful and then chose to be, then okay, it would be my fault. But I'm just, on this account, made sinful. So it seems like I'm being forced to be a sinner. And how can I be blamed for that? That's one of the first major objections. Secondly, original sin seems like a kind of moral bad luck. Let me take a pause here. What is moral luck? Well, let me give a simple example. Say you're out drinking late one night, which of course many of you probably never are because it's not legal. But let's just say that you're drinking late one night, and in fact you drink too much. and then you drive home. And you get home and you go to bed. Your friend, who was at the same bar and had just about as much to drink as you did, and was just about as tipsy as you, drove home and hit somebody and was cited for drunk driving and doesn't make it home. Well, that seems like an example of moral luck, because everybody in the community is going to say bad things about your friend, and your friend's going to feel bad in a way that you won't, because your friend hit somebody and you didn't. But you were both drunk, and you could have hit somebody. You just got lucky, right? You didn't hit them. So that seems like maybe a kind of moral luck. But it seems unfair for our ideas about each other to be based on sheer chance like that, right? So a lot of philosophers have actually said, well, actually, if you hit somebody or not, you're just as bad as the person who does hit somebody. It's really what you, the kind of trouble that you could have gotten yourself in because you were tipsy that counts, not whether you actually got yourself in trouble. So, but you can see that there are worries about the role of luck in the moral life. Well, original sin raises worries of a slightly different kind, still about luck, but here about your constitution. It turns out that you got unlucky in being the person that you are, according to the doctrine of original sin. You could have been born nice and pleasant, but no, you were born selfish. And well, again, why are you blamed when somebody else made you be born that way? I mean, you didn't get, going back to the first objection, you didn't get to decide how to be born. You just happened to be born that way. So again, it seems like luck is involved in a way that undermines your responsibility. So original sin seems like a kind of constitutional moral luck, the bad luck of being stuck with traits that I might not have wanted for myself, but just happened to me. And why should I be responsible for what's just a matter of luck? That doesn't seem fair. Well, there are plenty of other reasons to worry about original sin, and the two just mentioned may not in fact be the deepest, but they do come to mind readily, and they are widespread. So let's consider what should be said about them. I'll be happy to talk about other reasons you might have for disliking the idea of original sin at the end of my talk. I'm going to offer both a positive and negative defense of the idea of inherited sin, starting with the latter, the negative argument, which is, first of all, that these two criteria for responsibility that I've talked about, that you have to be able to voluntarily choose what you're responsible for, and that luck shouldn't be involved, these are too strong as rules for what we should be responsible for. If we were only responsible for what we voluntarily choose, or what's not lucky, we would find that we are not responsible for huge portions of our everyday lives, what we usually take to be the moral lives that we are responsible for. And I'll expand on that in a second. Let me also just mention that as an aside, these criteria are also too weak in the sense that you could fulfill both criteria and still not be responsible. Consider again the insanity problem. Insane people make considered choices and act on them without luck, and yet somehow we don't think that they're responsible. So more would have to be said about what makes you responsible than to just say that you made a considered choice. But we don't really have time to spend on that issue. So let me go back to the argument that these criteria for responsibility are too strong because they undermine responsibility for a lot of what we consider ourselves responsible for every day. Those who dislike the idea of original sin need to attend more carefully to the fact that a major component of our lives is what we attend to or fail to attend to. Consider racism. Many people think racism is more than deliberate or self-conscious prejudice. It also includes attending too much to or having the wrong associations with skin color. One example, Malcolm Gladwell's best-selling book, Blink, cites cognitive psych studies that show that most people take longer to make positive word associations with the phrase African American than they do when they hear the phrase European American. Right? So when they hear the phrase European American, it's easier to come up with positive words quickly than it is when they hear the phrase African American. This is a way of evoking people's unconscious associations. And I want to caution that there's a lot of debate over what exactly we should correlate with tests like this. It may not be the case that because it takes you longer to associate happy words with African American, that you're more likely not to hire one, for instance, right? Still, it is morally worrisome that people have these sorts of connections in their heads, even if it is involuntary. In fact, the very fact that these associations are involuntary is part of what is worrisome. It's very hard to clean up these associations in our heads. It's just a matter of how we see things. And it's not just what we choose to do consciously that says something about us, right? How we just react also says something very deep about what kind of people we are, what kind of commitments we have. Furthermore, what we don't do also says something important about us. And we just don't always have voluntary choice over those things. For instance, if you don't care about a friend's cultural or racial background, that can be a moral failing. But it may not be a choice that you made. In general, I think just a fact of life, we typically consider ourselves and other people responsible for giving too much attention to certain things. Like if somebody is too influenced by how good-looking people are, we think that's a flaw in them. Or we think that if you don't give enough attention to what you should, that that's a flaw. For instance, stereotypically, lots of men forget to be romantic after they've been married for a little while. And it's not necessarily that they decided 2.5 years into marriage, it's not going to be as big of a deal if I buy flowers. But nevertheless, somehow it sort of happens that they don't maybe buy flowers or plan dinners or something, a lot of times. And many wives consider that a flaw in the attentiveness of their spouses. It's something that people often feel they have to forgive. Well, these attentions are not typically chosen and voluntary. For instance, last year when I forgot that it was my brother's birthday until 2 weeks afterwards, I was blamed for that. Because I did all this work, I did not say, but I might have said, well, I didn't choose to do that, it just happened. And my brother would have rightly said, well, yeah, that's the problem with you. That kind of stuff happens with you, right? Forgetting, sure, in a way it's a kind of bad luck. Maybe if I'd gotten lucky, I could have noticed something that would have led me to think, oh, wait, I think it's my brother's birthday today. But in fact, that didn't happen, right? So it's kind of bad luck for me. And maybe that mitigates how blameworthy I am in some way, but I don't think it gets me off the hook. It still says something about my character flaw. And the same, I think, is true about racist associations. It might be kind of a sort of bad luck that I live in a society where whiteness is constantly associated with being clean and being happy and so on, and blackness is associated with threat. That might be a kind of bad luck, but I'm not sure that that gets me off the hook for being racist in certain ways. Now, people who want to defend the idea that we're only responsible for what we voluntarily choose or what we can control rather than is lucky, they have some options in responding to my comments. One typical path is to argue, well, actually, we do have a lot more control over those things than we realize. And they try to come up with ways that we can control our lives. But I posit, we can talk about this more later, that this is not a very promising strategy. For one thing, it would mean that we would have to be incredibly self-aware in ways that almost none of us are. And we don't typically think that these things like remembering birthdays that I've been talking about are part of our moral lives only if we're self-aware of them, right? And amongst other things, this strategy would have the funny implication that philosophers tend to be more responsible for things than, I don't know, people who work in steel mills and don't tend to be super self-reflective about their moral lives. That's a blatant stereotype. But you see where I'm going with this. It just seems silly that the more you think about your life, the more you're responsible for, and if you could somehow not think about yourself much at all, then you could get off scot-free. That seems weird. Well, another possibility is arguing that we are less responsible than we often tend to think. And this is also a very popular strategy in our society, especially if you read a lot of pop psych literature. There's an awful lot of people saying, well, it's not really your fault. Maybe it's your parents' fault. Or maybe it's the government's fault. Or maybe society, culture's fault, something like that, right? But again, I don't think it's a very attractive view. It means letting people off the hook morally for things that we typically do, in fact, blame them for or praise them for in terms of good stuff. So I think a more attractive view would explain how we can be possible for most of what we typically consider ourselves responsible for, so that we don't, in fact, have to change our practices of relating to each other morally very much. And I think there are theories that permit us to do that. So this is the positive part of my defense of original sin. There are theories that make sense of our moral responsibilities, and that can be used to defend being responsible for inherited sin. This is just a very brief sketch of a view that I think makes sense of our common sense ideas and practices concerning responsibility and blame. First, the intuitive center of my view is that what we care about when we talk about moral responsibility is self-disclosure. What kind of person are you? I think that's the deepest question when we talk about responsibility. Not what did you choose, but who are you? In caring about responsibility, we care about the kind of persons we are and what we stand for. And, succinctly, what we're responsible for is what we own in a particular sense of ownership, which I'll just call robust ownership. There are a lot of things that we own, but not robustly, because they don't reflect on us in a deep manner that the things we are morally accountable for reflect on us. For instance, the fact that my hair is kind of not quite the deep black color that I think it would be cool if it were, does not reflect on me in the same deep manner that my telling a lie would. Right? So there's a difference in that I own my hair, part of me, but my lie I own in a robust sense. It says something about my personality, my moral personality. And we think that mature responses to me take more seriously whether I lie than what color my hair is. Now, what we own robustly can come in degrees. For instance, I more deeply own a lie if I thought about it beforehand and decided to do it. Right? So that's part of why voluntary choice matters. It does matter if you thought about it and did it voluntarily. If your lie just kind of came out accidentally, maybe you were scared and you're just trying to run away, so you lie, well then I think you're a little less blameworthy. So responsibility comes in degrees, correlated with how deeply you own something. In general, I think voluntary choice increases responsibility, but that doesn't mean that what we are responsible for is limited to what we choose. What I'm at least minimally responsible for is what I robustly own. And I propose that we robustly own our mental states, our beliefs and desires, and the actions or inactions that they motivate, so long as we are not malfunctioning. In some vague and complicated sense, that includes being insane. This leaves us responsible for a lot, but by no means everything. It still allows us to make discriminations about what we are and are not responsible for. To take the easiest case, for instance, a person does not deeply own his beliefs during a schizophrenic break in which he has the delusion that his loving parents are actually trying to kill him. The upshot of this theory of responsibility, which I call reformed compatibilism, I won't bother to explain why, is that a more or less normally functioning human person is responsible for being who he or she is, but not necessarily for having become who he or she is. You can be responsible for who you are without having been responsible for becoming who you are. We don't, in fact, always have a lot of control over becoming who we are. And amongst other things, that implies that sin can have an external origin. I take it that racism is a kind of original sin. for which we can be fairly considered responsible. I doubt that it makes sense to say that all racists, or most racists, decide to be racists. They are often simply constituted by their societies as racists. Indeed, racism is often very much ignorant, not self-consciously chosen. And I think that should mitigate our blame. It's a lot worse to be a self-conscious racist than to be an ignorant one. Nevertheless, I think that people are responsible and blameworthy for being racist insofar as their beliefs and desires are racist. And that, I think, is a... At the same time, on this view, we can also have pity and compassion for racists. There's a pretty clear sense in which racists are typically trapped by racism, in a sense overcome by this sin. On my view then, the idea of original sin helps to teach us that blame is not inimical to compassion or pity. If we are attentive to the lack of control that sinners very often have, not just over their sins, but over their having become sinful, we can see that it is appropriate not only to judge that they fall short in the manner I have described as sin, but also to offer them grace. It is for such reasons that the doctrine of original sin provides a way of justifying and motivating forgiveness. On the one hand, it justifies forgiveness by calling sin, sin, in the proper sense of that word, meaning a culpable evil, and not giving way to therapeutic categories that would erase responsibility. Only sin can be forgiven. Forgiveness implies sin. And blameworthiness is one condition of the possibility of forgiveness. You don't forgive people unless they're blameworthy. But belief in original sins also motivates forgiveness by providing a perspective that helps us to see the reasonableness and appropriateness of forgiveness. It seems fitting to extend forgiveness to those who, in a world gone awry, cannot help but be sinners. Thus, while the doctrine of original sin is realistically somber, it is also appealingly humane. In fact, I believe that the doctrine of original sin seems pessimistic only to those who think that we ought to be able to justify ourselves by ourselves, a view that is tied to accounts of moral responsibility that denigrate not only inherited sin, but also divine grace. For those with a different theory of responsibility, however, what can seem most hopeless in the Christian doctrine of sin is actually uplifting. The belief that we are not masters of our own goodness and cannot simply justify ourselves, that our goodness is not simply up to us, is not a counsel of despair, but a testimony concerning our proper hope. The good news is that goodness is not an autonomous achievement, but a gift, one that we can and must appropriate joyfully. Thank you. Well, I'm happy to take thoughts or questions. Yeah, Kate.
Why is it so persistent?
Oh, hold on a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Kate.
I'm just curious, when you're talking about racism as a social sin, it's something that's brought about by certain social institutional structures,
Yeah.
and like a world gone awry. What is the appropriate response to the mechanisms that perpetuate this kind of social sin? Because in the same way that you can forgive and pity and have compassion on someone for, in your example, racism, where at the same time they're part of the social institutional mechanism that would perpetuate
Right.
that attitude and that sinfulness, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, like I say, I think we can have a mixed attitude towards persons and institutions that perpetuate evils, such that we can have a certain sense of understanding that they could be trapped, even by the powers that they themselves perpetuate. But nevertheless, we can also blame them and hold them responsible and call them to account, which means, amongst other things, we might punish them, we might ask them to reform, we might just say bad things about them. It depends, right? But I think this perspective of original sin helps us to see that their evil is not independent or self-sufficient in some way. It has a history. and in fact one that they may not be much in control of. Which again I think doesn't have to undermine our blaming them, but it shapes the manner in which we would do so. Brett, go ahead.
Why is it so persistent? I asked that, let me contextualize it. And one of the things that I find so interesting about Augustine's account of original sin is he distinguishes between our propensity for particular sins, you know, whether it's gluttony or
Right.
other kinds of, you know, libidinous desires or inclinations or so on. But he gets us to look deeper beneath that, to a fundamental orientation,
Yeah.
kind of self-love as opposed to the proper love of God and that kind of thing. What is the... Do we need something like that, or is there something like that at work also in your account? I mean, because on your account, I begin to diagnose it, I become more aware of it, and then I still can't change it often.
Yeah.
You know, I become aware of like, oh wow, I've been conditioned by my community and by my history, and so now I realize that some of my propensity to see race or gender or other things through that influence, but it still doesn't go away. Or
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and is that relevant, or is that significant, or is there? I'm just
Yeah.
wondering about that.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things going on in your question. I mean, one is the question of what can we do about stuff, and the other one is maybe a question about the relationship of sins to sin.
Yeah,
Something like that,
versus
right?
the actions.
So, let me take that second one first. Augustine does think that we have a fundamental warpedness. Luther talks about it as being bent
Yeah.
inwards, so that we're gazing at our stomachs rather than outside. And a lot of people have thought that means in Augustine that all sin is a kind of pride, which I actually think is false. I don't think Augustine believes that, contrary to most readings. So I came out with a paper this past spring arguing that Augustine does not think that all sin has the same fundamental features. In fact, he states at one point, not all sin is pride. So he does think that all sin has certain kinds of fundamental features, and I think he probably agrees with Luther that idolatry may be the best way to describe all sin. But on the other hand, I think because sin is always because evil, and therefore sin, is always a privation of goodness, it can also take on multitudinous forms insofar as it warps the good in different ways. And there's no positive thing called evil. There's just distortions of good stuff. So there's no one thing that sin would be, necessarily, because sin is not this sort of ontic category. It's an emptying of such categories. So I think that's a helpful, hopefully helpful way of rephrasing Augustine's view about these things. And I think that even so, there's this sense that, yeah, these things are handed down in ways that we cannot stop, ultimately. And that's part of what's somber about this doctrine.
Yeah.
But see, I think that if you think you can sort of eradicate sin, that you might do a lot worse things in your attempt to eradicate it than you will if you recognize that in some deep sense this is not up to human agency to simply end. Right? This good, actually, not simply kind of pessimism.
Yeah. One last point on that, and I'll turn it over to the rest of you guys. But I guess the thing that I'm always struck by, though, and that I find so fascinating with Augustine, is that note he makes in the story about the pears, that it's the sin itself that attracts us, though, and that's a condition that we're in, and that's, again, I'm wondering if,
Yeah.
I mean, the lucidity of your account's really wonderful, Jesse. I think heuristically it does a lot in terms of our ability to use the concept in a moral analysis. But that existential idea that it's that absence of good, or it's that privation of good that I'm actually drawn to.
Yeah.
You know, that condition. I wonder, you know, if that is still part of the narrative you're telling, or if that, you know, there needs to be something else. But you don't have to address that.
Yeah, well, just real quickly, it is part of the narrative I want to tell. I think that the idea that we're kind of born with these warped desires and commitments helps explain a lot of things about human psychology. I don't call them sin until one reaches the age of culpability, whatever that may be. It probably depends on the individual. But we do, in fact, I think in many cases start off with those kinds of warped desires, some of which may be social, but some of them I think actually are genetic. That's part of what some people might think would be radical about my account. But I do think that can help explain human action. Yeah.
On the topic of culpability, I wondered what you would say about the culpability of any one person or group's apathy towards subjects such as racism. I mean, it calls to mind in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. He says that he was most angered by the quote white moderate
Right.
who had the ability to do something about not only his situation but the civil rights movement at large, and that was for him what was most disturbing. It wasn't the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings and all these horrible things. I mean, not to excuse them, but he said that what most disturbed him was those who have the power and the moral capability, I don't know how else to put it, the capability morally to do something and then to not do that. So do you, I know you touched on something like that, but do you address how culpable one's apathy is in your writing?
No, I mean, not particularly extensively, but I think because I'm not actually talking that much, I'm more interested in the meta-ethical questions about what freedom looks like, what free will is, what the conditions for being responsible and blameworthy for things are. But I think that if you have the kind of account of responsibility that I'm offering, that opens your eyes to these sorts of practical concerns in a way that I think some accounts of responsibility tend to divert our attention away from these things because they tend to connect what we can control to responsibility so much. And so the things that are out of our control, I think, have often fallen by the wayside. And that's one reason why I think a lot of moral theory has been about individuated choices rather than, say, about the emotions that people have or don't have, and about the beliefs that they have or don't have. Yeah.
Well, Jesse, as you know, we have a lot of overlapping interests, and I have a ton of questions, but I'll limit it to two. I want to actually follow up with Brett just briefly. On your account, is original sin contingent? That is to say, would it be possible to be born without it in a certain ideal scenario? Because, especially when you turn to the sort of example of racism or something, it seems socially conditioned in such a way that it is more a sin than sinfulness as such. And that's where the finitude account of original sin sort of avoids that difficulty, and I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So you said you had two questions, but
that's the first.
Okay, I'll take this one up. We'll come back to your second one. All right. So, so here's one of the things that I didn't talk about because I didn't want to spend time on it. But Augustine thinks that original sin is one and the same in all human beings. Partly because he thinks we all share Adam's sin. And he thinks we share it directly. That is, Adam's sin is our sin because we're in Adam. My account draws on a little-known Reformed, potentially, it's not exactly a heresy, but some might think so. But that suggests that we have Adam's sin indirectly via having the same kind of sin that he had in our own lives. That's been passed down from generation to generation. But we don't share one and the same sin with Adam. We share the same type of sin with Adam. So I can agree that we share Adam's sin, but the manner in which I account for that is rather different from Augustine. Although, as I tried to indicate briefly, Augustine actually has two accounts of how sin gets shared, so I agree with half of Augustine's story. One of the implications of that is, and in my last chapter of my book manuscript talks about the idea of original sins. So I think that there's multiple original sins, not just one original sin. That is, there are multiple kinds of inherited sins that we have. And so your original sins and mine might be different. So that to that degree it's contingent. What I think is not particularly contingent is whether you'll have some and I'll have some. We'll both be bent in various ways. And those will both amount to a kind of idolization of things around us and a lack of a properly ordered love for God and the creation. So in that sense, we'll be very much the same. But we also can be different in these ways.
But I guess I'm wanting just to follow up on that. Is it then, by virtue of our Constitution, that we are bent? I mean,
Yes and no. I mean, here we get very complicated because you have to ask the question of who the real you is. And I think this is a more important question for a theologian in some ways. Because the Christian story says that in Christ we are a new creation. So that means that there's actually a real you that's not bent by original sin, but it's only held eschatologically in the future. So, I mean, but it's important, if you take the idea of justification by faith seriously, to say that there's a sense in which you are not bent because of the actions God accomplished in Jesus Christ. So what I'm talking about, and what Augustine always took himself to be talking about too, although he didn't always say this clearly, is second nature. So there is a sense in which you are bent by sin, and unavoidably so. That's a penultimate truth, however. And that's, I think, it's in that context that this doctrine is hopeful, as I tried to indicate at the end.
How about it doesn't seem just coincidental, though, that original sin is associated with not our ontological condition as persons, but with the ontological condition of creation per se. That is, I mean, Aquinas' account of that nature itself is warped, is transformed by original sin. I mean, it seems as if I followed your account correctly, that original sin would still be sin, but on your account, it's a less culpable kind of sin than the one for which you're robustly responsible. And yet, the ontological effects of original sin would seem, at least in Christian theology, would seem to be inverted. That is to say that original sin would have a more dramatic effect on the conditions of creation than my individual murder of somebody.
Yeah, well, okay. I think that the tradition actually is pretty good at making distinctions between, and I talk about this in an essay in Augustinian Studies on original sin that came out a couple years ago, but there's a difference between the evil that warps creation and the idea of original sin, because original sin is culpable evil, as I suggest, and the rest of creation, certainly for Augustine and Aquinas and most other folks, up till Peter Singer, can't have culpable evils, right? Because they're not persons. So only persons can have original sin. Other things can have inherited evils, but those wouldn't constitute sin on that story. But then secondly, I just want to, I mean, you suggested that I'm saying that we're not robustly responsible. That's not true. I think we are robustly responsible. It's just that my account of robust ownership is weaker than a lot of people's. Because a lot of people think that in order to robustly own something, you have to choose it knowingly. And I don't think you need to. Now, I think the weakness of that is an advantage because it makes better sense of very common practices, religious and non-religious. I mean, I didn't talk about this, but if you look at Christian or other confession of sin, it also tends to confess things that you don't choose. And some explanation needs to be given for that. Either it's misguided or it's defensible, as it is on this kind of theory of responsibility. Sorry, but you had a second question, which we forgot about.
I did. Do we have, I don't want to, somebody else has a question, let me jump in.
We have 10 minutes, so if you're worried about getting a question, it would be good to step forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, you know, in our shared interest in expanding responsibility, the sort of notion of responsibility to make it more robust, the one place where I feel like we diverge is that you want to say that the truly involuntary can be blameworthy.
Absolutely.
Right, and I don't. And I'm just wondering, so with something like racism, like it seems to me that, I guess I'm not at least initially convinced that what we're blaming there is the truly involuntary, but rather a sort of sin of omission or a culpable ignorance, right? A failure to combat what one has been, the social environment one's been raised in.
Right.
And not something that's actually involuntary. That it's
Right.
what we're blaming is the measure of voluntariness in it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to go through, very specific sorts of examples to try to work out this argument. I think that there are lots of cases where racism, sexism, other isms are voluntary. So I'm not asserting that it's always involuntary to be a racist or something like that. But I mean, I think the most difficult case on this topic for the person who cares about racism is the question of belief, right? But I take it that it's hard to give an account of racism if you don't talk about beliefs. But it seems to me that most of our beliefs are not things that we choose. They just sort of happen to us a lot of the time. You can do things to try to influence what you believe, right? C.S. Lewis said, if you want to be a Christian, go to church. I'm like, well, don't go to some churches, but anyway. Yeah, okay, but then, so maybe you're changing the odds a little bit. But if you really think that, maybe you have a better chance of becoming a Christian that way. Does that amount to controlling your belief? I have my suspicions. Furthermore, like I say, I just think there are a lot of things that you just can't do much about, whether you believe or not. I mean, there are plenty of times when people would like not to think certain things, and so they read up on the literature, and they just find themselves committed to these things. And I want to say in that case, well, it's your belief. And because it's your belief, which has been formed in you in a more or less properly functioning manner, I just don't see why shouldn't you be responsible for it. I mean, why do you have to be able to pull its strings, so to speak, in order to be called out for it? And it's your belief. It says something important about you that you believe that.
But I guess I just want to say that, or I'm curious how you would respond to the claim that what we're blaming there, now there's a certain sense once we're responsible, we take ownership over it, it is of us. But that what we blame is actually whether or not one assents to that belief, or withholds assent.
Yes.
So the belief itself isn't being blamed.
Right. Well, there again, I'm just pessimistic about how much control one has over one's assenting and so on. I mean, I think the implicit picture of human nature that you often end up with on a lot of these counts of responsibility is that there's like the real me, which is somehow like separate from the things that the other not so real me happens to feel, desire, or believe. And I just don't get that. I don't think we have this kind of power over ourselves. I don't know where it would come from. And I just don't see that being the way our lives work. A lot of the times we find out what we believe after the fact, when we find ourselves being really mad about something, and then you realize, oh, I guess I'm committed to this cause. And in general, we do things because we're motivated, but we don't always choose our motivations. And I think that happens with our beliefs a lot. They kind of, again, happen to us, and we don't even always know that they're happening to us. And so the amount that sometimes we can make assent or not to them, but then that's because we have other beliefs and motivations that give us that ability. And over those, we don't necessarily have a lot of control. So if you follow the train back, I don't think you find some point at which there's this all-powerful choosing ability. And I think a lot of theories need that, but it's just not I just don't see that it's a plausible account of what it means to be a human being. So I don't mean to say that we can't voluntarily try to influence ourselves, but I think that the ability to do that is always predicated on other things that we didn't choose. So the real issue here is that we don't have what some people call, as you probably know, ultimate responsibility for these things.
Is there a question? Time for one more.
I'm not sure if I'm connecting this correctly, but just based on that question, you were just talking about we don't have ultimate responsibility. That led me towards thinking about what we were talking in class the other day about Nietzsche's intellectual conscience and about how much responsibility do we have to, take apart our beliefs and analyze why we have them.
Yeah.
It seems kind of like that's a little bit in conflict. Like if we don't have that much control over our beliefs, then how can we really push them?
Yeah, good question. Well, I've been trying to assert, maybe not quite as well as I should have been, that my view is not fatalistic. So it doesn't mean that you can't help anything. The fact that a lot of these things are not up to us in some strong sense doesn't mean that we can't try to influence ourselves. And this is because we're reflexive beings, right? So we can have various levels of commitments, different kinds of commitments, and those are sometimes in tension with one another. And so if you have, both the desire to be lazy and the desire to be a responsible person, then those can come into conflict. And there are things you can do to sort of encourage one of those things as opposed to the other and help it win out. So it's not as though we don't have certain kinds of control over our lives, and decisions do in fact matter. But my argument is that they don't matter as much as we like to think a lot of the times. And we typically don't have as much control as especially the American story likes to make it out that we have. So yeah, you've got things that you can and should do about your intellectual responsibilities. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are severe limitations to how far you can take that.
Thank you very much, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.